Don't worry about it right now. We'll talk later. So we're gonna talk in this section of our unit about evolution, natural selection, a little bit about the history of life on Earth. A lot of it will probably be some review from what we learned back in 7th grade, but there will also be a bunch of new things as well. So we talk about evolution. You know, one of the biggest misconceptions that people have is in how they talk about evolution or adaptation. In that, a lot of times what I'll hear or students will write on the paper is that the mouse adapted to its ecosystem. Okay? But that's not the way that evolution works. An individual cannot adapt. An individual organism, a mouse, a human, a fish, a tree, a bacteria, cannot adapt. Okay? The traits that an organism has are fixed, basically. Okay? And that genes determine which characteristics a species have, and they don't change really. Okay? You can't develop a new characteristic just because it might be helpful. So what can evolve? What can adapt? If an individual cannot adapt or cannot evolve, cannot really change, what can? Cormac?
A species.
A species, a population, a group can change over time, but an individual cannot. So all good. There we go. So evolution, there could be a variety of definitions. But we could say it's a change in the genes of a population over time. You know, a lot of times they say a change in a species over time. But what's really changing about that species are the genes, the DNA. And so the important point is that populations can evolve over time, not individuals. I'm going to watch a video at some point about natural selection in this type of mouse. And the mouse changes over time. But one individual mouse can't change. It's born with whatever genes it has, with whatever fur color, whatever traits, and it dies with those traits. So the individual doesn't change, but the whole population over time can change. The makeup of the genes within that group can change. The group, the population, the species can adapt. So when we talk about evolution, we talk about the theory of evolution. Okay? And an important detail knows, what does that mean, theory? Because we use that sort of in everyday language different than we use it in science. Because in everyday sort of speech, if I say I have a theory about who's going to win the game on Thursday, what do I mean when I'm talking about in my everyday language of theory? It's just sort of a guess. You know, it's just sort of, well, this is what I think. But in science, the way that we use the word theory is a theory is a well-documented, well-researched, well-accepted explanation of a certain phenomenon. Okay? It's been tested many times. It's been confirmed many times. Like the theory of gravity. That is a theory. Atomic theory. The theory about the structure of the atom. Okay? Theory of evolution. These are all theories, but it doesn't mean like they're up for debate in the scientific community. It doesn't mean, well, it's just what somebody might think. Things that have been tested over and over again and eventually are elevated to the level of theory. Theory is like the top level of how confident scientists are in their ideas. Okay? And that if they deem something a theory, it's well tested, well accepted. Now, all theories in science can be overturned. But the theory of evolution is well accepted. Okay. Yes, Sebastian?
Who decides like what's what? Like,
well, it's not really like there's some committee that says, okay, evolution is now a theory. We've elevated it. It's sort of the general agreement that scientists who study those topics sort of agree on. If you think about something like climate change, you know, there's not one group that says, yes, humans have increased carbon dioxide and it's leading to a climate change. It's sort of the overall research of what scientists that study climate sort of agree on after looking at all this research. And sometimes there's not agreement. Sometimes there's disagreement about certain details of things. And there's still research done in evolution about the mechanisms of evolution, how important various factors are, and epigenetics and other factors. But the overall theory is well accepted. So how do we know that? How do we know that over time species change? Because the dominating, before Darwin, the dominant idea was the fixed species concept, that species were created one way and they stayed that way. They never would change. They stay that way forever and they will always be that way. That was the fixed concept. But Darwin and other scientists, Wallace and other scientists, started to change those ideas and said, well, maybe species have not always been the same. Maybe at some point in the past, species were different than they are today. Okay? Maybe at some point in the future, these species are going to change. Because the idea, evolution was the idea that these species are not just fixed in time, but they can change. And Darwin told us about how that happens through natural selection. So we know that these species change by looking at lots of different types of evidence. These are some of them. So we look at the fossil record. We'll talk about each of these. We talk about comparative anatomy, biochemistry, embryology, molecular biology, biogeography. These are all sort of little pieces of evidence that can tell us how species have changed, and we'll get into some of the details. So fossils are, fossils are one of the first types of evidence of evolution. People have found fossils for thousands of years and wondered about them. What are these things? And so the fossil record gives us a lot of information about species and what they were like in the past. The fossil is created when the traces or the remains of an organism is preserved, usually in rock. Okay? And we can see those things and study them. And when we look at the fossil record, what we see is that about 99% of all species that have been on the Earth are extinct. Species currently in existence are only about 1% of the species that have ever lived on Earth. Most species are extinct. We can look at rocks and fossils, and we can date them. We can use radioactive dating. You guys studied that in Earth science?
Yeah.
Okay. So we can use radioactive isotopes and the breakdown of them to sort of date various rocks and fossils, and we can see sort of how old they are. Based on that research, we know the Earth's about 4.6 billion years old. Pretty old. We'll talk a little bit more about the history of life on Earth and how things evolved. But what's important in terms of the fossil record are these transitional fossils. These fossils that we find that show sort of an in-between stage. So if we know horses, for example, okay, scientists have found fossils of horse-like ancestors from 60 million years ago. 60 million years ago, horses were tiny little, not tiny, but fox-like sized creatures. They had toes, separate toes. Okay, and so obviously we don't find those alive today on the Earth, but we do find fossils of them from 60 million years ago. So that's important. But not only that, we've also found fossils, transitional fossils, that show us sort of the steps. So how did this creature go to what we think of as our modern horse? Okay? Not only do we have the fossils of the old extinct 60 million year old horse, but we have in between stages. We can find fossils from 40 million years ago and find horse ancestors that are a little bit larger. And what the other difference is the toes, okay? That the toes gradually over time were reduced into 3 toes and 2 toes, and really today just a single toe, a hoof we might call it. But there still are the tiny little sort of vestigial toes that are part of a horse's hoof. But we find those steps in between. And scientists do a lot of work trying to figure out, okay, well, did this species lead to this, or was that a branch that just died out? And so there's a lot of study of that. But we have those in-between stages. This is Archaeopteryx, a transitional fossil that helps scientists understand that birds evolved from reptiles. And Archaeopteryx is an ancient extinct bird slash reptile sort of species. It had feathers, but had a bony tail. It had teeth, unlike modern birds, but it had feathers. So it has sort of in-between structures that indicate reptile origins of birds. We have trilobites that are no longer on Earth. They are now extinct. We even get the imprints, the footprints of dinosaurs that have been preserved in rock. So these different types of fossils help us understand how species evolve. We also looked at the anatomy, the current anatomy of living organisms, and the similarities in that anatomy or the differences can tell us about the evolutionary history of these species and help us understand common ancestry. And we have a couple different terms that we use when we talk about these structures. Homologous structures, analogous structures, and vestigial structures. Homologous structures are structures that are a type of evidence showing that species have a common ancestry. For example, and this is one of the most commonly used ones, when we look at a human arm and a whale's flipper and the bat's wing, and we look closely at from external examination, they would appear to be very different. An arm versus a flipper versus a wing. They have different functions. But when we look carefully at the internal skeletal anatomy of those species, what we see is that they're actually pretty similar. All of those species have that single upper arm bone, the humerus, and then two sort of forearm bones. Okay? We call those the ulna and the radius. Then the wrist bones, then the finger bones. And they're there, they're modified, they've changed through time. Some have become thicker, some longer, some shorter. But really, we're looking at the same bones. And the reason they're so similar, the reason these homologous structures exist, is because these species had a common ancestor. They evolved from a common ancestor at some point in the past, and therefore these structures are similar. They've modified over time through evolution, but they're similar. Analogous structures are structures that fulfill a similar function, okay, but they don't show common ancestry. For example, if we look at a bat's wing and a bird's wing and an insect's wing, what do they have in common?
They're wings.
They're all used for flight. They all help these organisms fly through the air. So they're analogous to each other. But when we look at the structure of them, they're all derived from quite different sources. I mean, the bat and the bird are more similar than the insect. But what you see is different structure of bones. So this shows us what we call convergent evolution, in that oftentimes we'll see similar structures evolve in species depending on their habitat or depending on where they live. For example, a shark and a dolphin, in outward appearance might seem very similar. Similar in shape, similar fins, okay? But they're similar not because they share a recent common ancestor. They're similar because why? Why is a shark and a dolphin, why do they share similar characteristics? If they don't evolve from a recent common ancestor, Cormac?
They live in the same.
Yes, they adapted to similar conditions. Okay? They both adapted to life in the oceans, but they did that in different ways. They evolved similar structures, even though they don't derive from the same place. And then the last one are the vestigial structures, kind of leftover anatomy, the remains of evolutionary past in species. Things like the human appendix, ear muscles. Can anyone move their ears? I can't. Some people can?
Wait,
I don't know.
wait, you have to look.
You have muscles. Oh, yeah. Some people want to learn how to use them, some didn't. But anyway, we don't really need those. They have no real function in humans today. And again, there is a leftover remains, vestigial structures of our ancient ancestry. Pelvic bones in snakes. Snakes have no legs. They don't require a pelvis, but they still have the bones of the pelvis in their skeleton. Okay? And they're there. They even have, some snakes, tiny little femurs that are internal, that are, again, sort of leftover evolutionary history of those species. Some more evidence. Comparative biochemistry. Biochemistry is looking at the molecules, the chemistry of living things. When we look at species that we believe are closely related, and we look at their biochemistry, the makeup of various molecules and proteins, we see that they are similar. Similarities. Again, this is related to molecular biology, in which we look at similar molecules and compare it between species. And closely related species have more similarities. So these help us understand common ancestry. And comparative biochemistry allows us to use one species to replicate another species. We can test a drug in a rat, and we can know that it has some similarities with human biochemical pathways. So if the drug works in one way in a rat, then it's likely it will work in a similar way in a human because they have similar biochemistry. When we look at certain molecules between different species, we can compare them. Modern biology allows us to sort of sequence proteins and DNA sequences, basically reading the parts that make up those molecules. Cytochrome C is an enzyme that is very common in almost all living things. And so we use that as sort of a benchmark. How different is this cytochrome C molecule when we compare two species? Okay. So here's just some examples. When you look at the cytochrome C protein and look at the sequence of amino acids that make up that protein, when we compare humans to a chimp, cytochrome C is identical between the two of them. We compare a human to a mouse, it's about 91.3% the same. And you can look down the list and you can see, when you compare the cytochrome C of a protist, a euglena, to a human, it's quite different. It's 56% similar. So what we see, this helps us understand how these species are related. Here's another table that shows this. Okay, if you look at this chart, okay, so between a rat and a human, the cytochrome C, there are 34 differences in amino acids on that cytochrome C. You can compare that. If you look at the human compared to the yeast, there's 110 differences. Okay, compared to the fruit fly, 106. Okay, so there's another way to tell how species are related. We can compare the embryos of different species. Embryos of different species, often their early development sort of indicates sort of their evolutionary past. All vertebrates, basically, their embryos, have gill slits in the early stages of embryonic development. Now those gill slits disappear eventually in some species. They remain in other species, but they indicate that all of those vertebrates share a common ancestor. So when we look at the various stages of development, okay, what you have is a lizard, a tortoise, a pig, and a human. In the early stages, embryos all look pretty similar. It would be difficult to tell them apart. See the gill slits here. See the long tail. Okay? As their embryonic development proceeds, they start to become different from each other and eventually quite different from each other.
That baby pig is really cute.
But you can see those similarities tell us they had a common ancestor.
Some of them look like lizards.
Yeah. We look at where species, biogeography, the location of various species. And again, that helps us understand evolution. If we compare fossils in different areas, we can see examples of convergent evolution. We can see that marsupials, which are quite different from placental mammals, but they're found in both Australia and South America. Why would they be found in both South America and Australia? These continents separated by thousands of miles of ocean. Come on, Earth Science. Use that Earth Science.
Wait, what?
Why are marsupials found in South America and Australia? Did they paddle their way there on tiny canoes? What might be called map?
So the continents were together at one point.
Yeah, because throughout the history of the Earth, continents have moved.
Well, actually, South America and Australia are still like not that close to each other.
Right, but they were one landmass, indicating a species could evolve, and then as they separate, we still have marsupials in both places. All right, so that's our evidence. So let's talk a little bit about Charles Darwin and how we know. Now we'll talk a little bit about how do these changes happen. So we should know that Charles Darwin was the scientist we most associate with the idea of natural selection, although he had a counterpart, another colleague, that came up with many of the same ideas as Darwin at about the same time. In fact, they met each other. The other scientist's name was Alfred Russel Wallace, and he was coming up with similar ideas, and we'll learn a little bit more about that. But Darwin was English. He was a naturalist, meaning a person who just had general interest in nature, a sort of general scientist who studied plants and animals and fossils and all sorts of different things. He had the opportunity to go on the HMS Beagle, a ship that was going to travel around the world, stopping at a variety of different continents. Okay? He was only about 22 years old when he set forth on the Beagle. You could see the path that the Beagle took, setting out from England, bouncing around. He bounced all around the coast of South America, okay, up the western coast. They then traveled over to Australia, okay, all the way down through around Africa, back to South America, until eventually making their way back to England. Took several years, this journey. And along the way, Darwin, what he did is basically studied the living things in all these different areas, took very careful notes. He collected specimens of fossils, of birds, had huge collections that he put on board the ship. Basically just studying all about these various areas. And they explored the Galapagos Islands, South America, Australia, Africa, and collected along the way all this different fossils and different samples, and then brought them back and spent a long time back in England really studying and formulating his ideas about natural selection. And the questions that Darwin was asking was, okay, well, why are these species that live in the same area so similar but with some differences between them? Started thinking about common ancestry. Started thinking, where did these species come from? Why is there such variety? Why do animals that developed in quite different geographic regions but in similar environments have similar characteristics? And eventually, in 1859, he published several books, but the one related to evolution was on the origin of the species. In 1859, he became a bestseller. He became a well-known scientist. And there had been people that said species change over time long before Darwin. Again, they found fossils. They knew certain things were extinct. But Darwin's contribution really was natural selection, about the mechanism. How do these species change over time? And so we know today that natural selection is one of the main mechanisms that drives evolution. It drives species to change. It's not the only one, but it is one of the main ones. Darwin didn't know certain things. He didn't know about DNA. He didn't know about genes. He didn't know why there was variation. We didn't learn that until a while later. And so when we think about natural selection, this concept, we break it down into a bunch of things. First, we know that in nature, most living things produce more offspring than can possibly survive. So a fish, for example, may spawn and release hundreds of thousands of eggs. They cannot all survive into adulthood. Only a small fraction live. Okay? There's overpopulation in the natural world. Most species produce more offspring than can survive. Okay? And this leads to competition. So if they're not all going to survive, there's going to be some competition. Maybe it's to get a limited resource like food or water or oxygen. Maybe there's competition to find mates. Maybe there's competition for nesting sites. Maybe there's a competition to avoid predators. There's lots of different types of things that living things have to struggle to survive against. So there's a struggle for survival. And there's also this variation in that in all species, every member is not identical. Obviously, if you look around the room, we are not all identical to each other. Even though we're a single species, there's wide variation in many different aspects of us. And that's true of all species. Now, we notice it most in humans, because we're all humans, and we're sort of tuned in to noticing differences. But squirrels have just as much variety, even though we say, oh, it's just a squirrel, they all look the same. They don't. All species have this built-in variety in terms of their characteristics. And in nature, some of these individuals are going to have variations that are more helpful than others. Okay? We're going to say they're better able to survive. They're better adapted. And these individuals that are best adapted to whatever conditions they're living in, they're more likely to survive. And if they're more likely to survive, they can be more likely to reproduce. When they reproduce, they pass on these traits, these beneficial traits that help them survive. They pass those on to their offspring. Right? And that, over time, over many generations, leads to a species changing. The thing that determines which individuals survive and which do not, we call that the selecting agent. You know, depending on the environment, if it's a limited amount of food, then food is the selecting agent. That not all of those individuals are going to be able to get enough food, stay here, to survive, and so the food is the selecting agent. Other times a predator may be preying on these species, and predators are the selecting agent. Just sort of depends on that individual situation. But over long periods of time, these traits, these beneficial traits that helped the species survive, they start to accumulate. They become more and more common. And over a period of time, that leads to the evolution of the population. The way we often term this is survival of the fittest. What does fittest mean? So,
Most evolved.
Antonio?
Best adapted.
Yeah, the best adapted. We can't say survival. It doesn't say survival of the strongest, or fastest, or biggest. It's survival of the fittest. And in this way, fittest means sort of just has whatever characteristics are most helpful. That makes a species fit. It could be big and strong, or it might be small and fast. Or maybe it's smart. or maybe it's camouflage. We don't know. It depends on the individual situation. But fittest means best suited to that specific ecosystem. If we look at how that looks, an example. Okay, we have a group of deer here. More of those deer are born than can survive. Some are going to die along the way. Sad but true. Okay. And so they're not all going to survive in the variety. And there's some variation there. They're not all the same. There might be differences in fur color, differences in speed, in size. And so there's some variation. And then we have selection. That because they're not all going to survive, there's some selecting agent. Something's going to determine which survive and which don't. Maybe it's the temperature. Okay? Maybe it gets so cold that only some of these deer are going to survive. Okay? The ones that survive, maybe they had a thicker coat. Maybe they had a thicker layer of fat underneath due to some random mutation they had. But for some reason, some of them are going to be more likely to survive, and those are the only ones that can reproduce. And when they reproduce, they give birth to offspring that are similar to them. And so over time, this happens again. And over time, this population eventually changes.
Did you do a new lab for that moth?
The pepper moth? I didn't do a new one. It's the same one. You need it?
I have different charts. You had a 10-second limit on there?
Yeah.
Yeah. Mine has a whole limit. Awesome. Thank you.
All right.
Sorry to intrude.
So yeah.
Mr. Durrell, is that you taking the picture?
What's that?
Is that
Mr. Arcuri and his buddies having a pool party. So yeah, natural selection still works. So we see the two sandals holding the power strip
That works.
to power their radio there in the middle of the pool.
Why can't it just play it with the cloud outside?
Can we take a break, Mr. Durrell?
Not yet. All right, so let's talk about a few examples here. Giraffes. So, giraffes evolved from smaller, shorter-necked offspring. Okay? And again, there's variation. If we were to measure all the length of our necks, it would vary from person to person. We all don't have a neck that's 16 centimeters long. There's some variation there. Again, there's probably variation in all species in that aspect. So, there's a variation in neck length, and depending on the ecosystem that those original giraffes were living in, certain variations in neck length were an advantage. Okay? Now, if their ecosystem happened to be that food was up in the trees. Okay? And in those situations, giraffes that happen to be born with a variation giving them a slightly longer neck could reach more food than the other giraffes. Not only has to be a small difference, even if they can reach a small amount more food, they're still going to have more energy. And they're more likely to survive, and they're more likely to reproduce. And in passing on those genes to their offspring had a longer neck as well. Okay? There's differential survival. The giraffes that have a slightly longer neck could get more food. And so they reproduced and gave birth to more long-necked giraffes. There's going to be plenty of normal-necked giraffes in that population. But then in the next generation, a repeat. The ones with longer necks happen to have a little bit better survival rates than the others. And so again, they reproduce more often, and now a higher percent of the offspring have a longer neck. And if you repeat this for millions of years, you end up with these small little changes. You know, the giraffes didn't go one generation from having a short neck to a neck that's 9 feet long. It gradually happened. These little changes gradually build up. If you had a recipe for chocolate chip cookies that you got from your friend and they're really good, you could give it to your friend and you can copy it down. Is it possible that your friend makes a mistake?
Yeah.
Or they think the 5 is a 3, or maybe they thought teaspoon was tablespoon. They may make a mistake. And then you give that recipe to another friend. You repeated that 1,000 times. When you look at that recipe after 1,000 times, how do you think it's going to look compared to the original?
Quite different.
Probably quite different. Just like playing telephone.
So natural selection space is just basically a gigantic game of telephone.
Yes, yes. And these tiny little changes can build up over time. Okay? And as they build up over time, then that's what leads to a species changing. And you see this. You know, we have different ideas about how giraffes evolved, but again, they evolved from shorter necked ancestors over a period of million years. And along the way, there are sort of dead ends, species that could not survive, species that became extinct. And then the other question, well, what if their environment changes? What if the trees in that area somehow, for some reason, die and their food is no longer in the trees and it's on the ground? Now what happens to those longer necked giraffes?
They start getting smaller.
Well, maybe it's tougher to get food, to maneuver that huge neck and get food off the ground, and so then it's no longer an advantage. And which giraffes are going to live better? The ones that have just a little bit shorter neck. And again, that process could repeat because we have a different selecting agent. Peppered moths, if you remember from 7th grade. Peppered moths come in different variations, lighter and darker. Okay? The struggle there, the selecting agent, was predators. A lot of birds like to eat these moths. And so, because there was some variation in the color of these moths, before the Industrial Revolution, the lighter colored moths were far more common because the trees were lighter in color. They had lichen growing on them. After the Industrial Revolution, the environment changed. And this change in the environment meant that the trees became darker. And now the lighter colored moth no longer has an advantage. The darker colored moth has an advantage. So the few darker colored moths that were in that population survived better, reproduced more. And then more of the moths were dark in color. And then more, and eventually most of the moths now in those areas are dark in color. And again, you see that. Light colored moths on the dark background stand out versus before those trees were darker. That's what they look like. Okay, the last concept, last example, is drug resistance in bacteria. So when you take an antibiotic to clear up an infection, maybe you have an ear infection. Your ear hurts. So you go to the doctor, they give you an antibiotic, and you start taking it, and they give you that pink liquid, amoxicillin, that tastes like bubble gum.
That tastes so good. No, it tastes like sugar.
Yeah? So they give you some amoxicillin.
It doesn't taste like bubble.
You start taking it for the first day. Then the second day. Now you start feeling a little bit better. That population of bacteria that's in your ear, that's living there, causing your ear to become inflamed and hurt, some of those bacteria are more susceptible to the antibiotic, but more easily killed by it. Some have higher resistance levels, so these darker circles. But there's some variation there. Now the selecting agent is the antibiotic. So which of these bacteria are going to die off first? Yeah, the ones that are not very resistant. They're going to die in the first couple days. Okay? Then the next day you take it. Again, now you're killing maybe the medium resistant ones. And after you take it for a couple days, now you start feeling better because almost all those bacteria are dead. And your ear feels better. And so you stop taking your antibiotic. Is that a good idea? What do they always say on your prescription? 10 days usually. Take it all. You have to finish the prescription. Because if you stop taking it after 3 or 4 days, maybe you didn't kill all the bacteria. Maybe there's a few that are left. But those few that are left, why are they still alive? They're the most resistant. They were able to tolerate this amoxicillin for 4 or 5 days. And so if you stop taking it, what can they begin to do? So we know they survive. Now they can reproduce, and your infection comes back. But this time, it's worse because these bacteria that are now in your ear, they're resistant to amoxicillin. So if you say, oh, I better start taking it again, maybe it's not effective. And maybe you have to go back to the doctor and get a stronger antibiotic. There are some bacteria that are resistant to almost all some bacteria that have developed resistance to almost all modern antibiotics. These are very dangerous bacteria because we don't have a good way of controlling them. So if you get an infection with one of these bacteria, it can stick around for a lot longer. You've heard of MRSA before? Okay, you know what it stands for? and make sure I do.
No,
Methicillin resistant Staphylococcus aureus. So it's a staph infection, a skin infection, but it is resistant to a class of antibiotics based on methicillin. And so it's resistant to many of those, so you need strong antibiotics to control that. And a lot of people believe that these resistant bacteria are coming about because of the overuse of antibiotics, giving it to people when they don't actually need it, feeding it to livestock constantly to prevent disease and cause them to grow larger. And so the overuse of some of these antibiotics has been questioned. All right. So
my dad was in the hospital one time. There's this guy who had the same name as him and the same birthday as him,
really?
and he had MRSA. So every person who wanted to go into his room and all the nurses wanted to talk to him, they were all in like these big like bodysuits, and they wouldn't let us go see him because they said that he was like contagious and all that.
Oh, really?
So it was very stressful.
All right.
They thought we had MRSA.
All right, so we're gonna stop here for today in our notes, and tomorrow we'll talk a little bit. All right, so what has been added since the 1800s? What other new information have we added to our understanding of natural selection to help us understand it a little bit better?